Earlier today, Iran launched missiles at American bases in Qatar and Iraq. So everybody's asking, is this the start of World War III or is this just Iranian saber rattling? So here to give us his insight is Will Tebow. He's an Army Ranger veteran and the director of the American Military Project. So Will, just walk us through what happened today and how it's actually going to affect Trump's objectives that we've seen so far.
Thanks, Jill. Iran knew they needed to respond in order to save face domestically, primarily, and to some extent on the international stage. But this was a domestic political face-saving move. You saw maybe a few dozen missiles, short to medium range missiles and rockets launch at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which was a huge hub of U.S. military activity in the Middle East. There's some reporting of rocket fire at bases in Iraq, but it was, by all accounts, a fairly modest effort to retaliate. And in fact, Iran themselves said, we fired the same number of missiles as you dropped and fired at us. We can only pray that this is exactly how President Trump drew it up in many ways. It's similar to their response after the killing of Qasem Soleimani when he was in Iraq targeting U.S. troops, where they launched missiles into the desert of a U.S. Airstrip in western Iraq. And this is, I think, a chance that peace is possible and even more realistic than any other eventuality. But I think it's worth noting that the future here it's a deal, it's negotiations, and it's diplomacy. That's clearly what it seems President Trump is signaling. He wants the violence to end, and now diplomacy takes shape, and we're going to get, in many ways, to where we started, which was a deal that is better than the Obama JCPOA and more enduring than the conflict we've seen the last 2 weeks.
Well, that's what interests me the most. I mean, let's talk about the best case scenario. So, if and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're telling me is, look, this response is the response. We've seen this song and dance before many times over decades with Iran, right? So we know, we can judge by the response that this is really a laydown. I mean, this is saying, okay, we're going to do this pro forma. We have to do something, and now we can go to the negotiating table. I mean, that's what you're telling me. And so, if that happens, what's the best case here? What does that look like? How does that happen? What are the next steps?
President Trump wants a better deal than President Obama received when he signed it during his second term with the JCPOA. There are a few things to look for that I think would make for a better deal. There was evidence back in April that the Iranians were open to having U.S. inspectors at their nuclear facilities. Obviously, now there's a question of where those facilities would be, but it's significant that under the Trump deal, U.S. personnel, presumably State Department officials, would be able to inspect the Iranian nuclear program and give us that much more fidelity as opposed to just trusting foreigners at the IAEA. That's one thing. And I think President Trump also wants to see zero weapons grade enrichment, certainly below the 3.5% enrichment threshold that the Obama team received under the JCPOA. He wants no nuclear weapons program. If he can achieve American validation of no nuclear weapons program whatsoever, I think President Trump's going to sign that deal, and it's going to be something that is much more enduring, because the alternative is continued war. The alternative is regime change, because that's the only way to provide for the security of the region. Right now, their nuclear program is heading underground. So there has to be some means of sussing it out and finding out what's there, whether it's by force or diplomacy. And it looks like diplomacy may be the preferred option for all parties right now.
So let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because we've seen the threats now that Iran might close this. Of course, it's only like 2 miles wide. And everybody knows when you talk about the Middle East, it's all about oil and getting it out to the rest of the world. So this is a very important stretch there. So what happens, and lay it out for our audience, if this is actually closed for any length of time?
Jill, I think that's a pretty severe step. If the Iranian government were to functionally close the Strait of Hormuz. It's a huge traffic route for oil from the Middle East, not just Iran, but some of the other Gulf Arab states. not much U.S. oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz at this time, but a lot goes through China. And it is a source of income for all the Gulf states, for both obviously Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the others. So in many ways, closing the Strait of Hormuz would be suicidal for the Iranian regime. It would choke their economy. It would obviously raise the price of oil, but the traffic of Iranian supply to the rest of the world would stop. You do have to look at China, though. The Chinese have relied on oil from the Strait of Hormuz in the past, but they did just complete a railroad from China to Iran that obviously bypasses water, completely. And so it's a tricky situation. The Strait of Hormuz is really valuable, but Iran has to understand that once they close the Strait of Hormuz, they're making an enemy, more so than they already have, out of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, even to some extent. And that would be an extreme, I think that would be a sign that escalation is on the Ayatollah's mind. And that's something to which we really need to pay attention. But, I think if you look at the oil futures market today, it's looking optimistic. But again, we should be clear-eyed about what that threat is and what it would mean if Iran were to take the steps to restrict shipping activity through the strait.
So one of the things I noticed this weekend, Will, is that there's a lot of experts in getting rid of nuclear sites on the internet. Apparently, most people are experts at this. But there is this looming question, right, about to what extent did we eradicate their nuclear program? And goes so far as to, some people say, well, what Trump did was pro forma. Let's just drop the bombs. We'll destroy some bad stuff. But now we can move on and sort of check the box. Now, I don't believe that that's what Trump himself wants to do. I know he actually wants to get rid of the nuclear program. But how do we know that we've really taken a toll on this and that it's safe, it's free and clear?
Matt, we can't be sure unless there are diplomatic or military means to find out what's there. In the Army, we had what's called a battle damage assessment. That's where you figure out what happened, how many people survived or didn't, if you got the guy you wanted on a mission. You always conducted a battle damage assessment, and oftentimes you wouldn't be able to do the best kind of BDA, as we called it, without some sort of boots on the ground. Maybe they can be civilian boots who are inspectors, or perhaps they have to be military boots, but you have to find some way to get boots on the ground. I imagine the Iranians, and there's some indication if you just listen to the statements of President Trump, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, and Secretary Rubio, that some semblance of the Iranian nuclear program remains. Now, whether they're able to replicate the robust facilities at Fordo, for example, I highly doubt that. I imagine that's probably known to Israeli and U.S. intelligence officials, but it's not a destroyed program. It still exists, and it's still a threat that we need to consider into the future. Maybe there's a 6-month, 1 year, or 3-year delay, but let's remember to 3 years ago, there was still an Iranian nuclear program about which we were worried. So the issue is not resolved. That's kind of my entire point about looking for what's next, is there has to be some mechanism of ensuring Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. And there are, as far as I see it, 2 ways to do it. The status quo is untenable because there's no way to see if they have a nuclear weapon or not. They've gone underground. There's still active hostilities with Israel. And so we need to push towards a resolution that gives us more visibility into their program.
So another question for you. Well, we have you here. I've noticed you've been doing media appearances, on this issue the last week or so. This is on the domestic side, this is a trying time for MAGA Maha, right? I mean, there's a lot of tension. I think this tension is normal and healthy in a large coalition, but there's a lot of tension when it comes to foreign policy. There's a lot in the line, and clearly at the extremes, right, there is disagreement. And the way I not so jokingly described it to my team early this morning was, on the one hand, I got Groiper Hitler 666 anon account on Twitter saying MAGA is over and Trump is a Jew, and then on the other hand, I got Lindsey Graham, wargasming, and happy that we're taking action. It seems to me there's a lot of space in the middle, which is probably where most people are. But nonetheless, this is serious stuff as we try to hash out an American foreign policy that makes sense for the 21st century. You can sense the tension within the administration. You can sense the tension in the audience and among the commentariat. What are your thoughts about this?
It's obviously a great observation, Matt. I do think the tension is real. And I think also the risk to the coalition is still real. If we proceed with the understanding that we're devoting bandwidth, resources, and hardware, military hardware to the Middle East, I think that's in tension with what many people expected from a second Trump term. Now, both sides, both extremes, as you identify, have some recompense with what the status quo will actually be. It's clear that the Trump administration does not seek a path to regime change. I don't think that we're going to play an explicit active role in overthrowing the Ayatollah anytime soon, if today's activities are any indication. And there are a lot of people who are angling for that. And similarly, we are clearly not operating with a leader who sees pacifism or the absence of U.S. activity in different regions throughout the world as his goal. If President Trump seeks or sees it as necessary to act, he is going to act, even if it means dropping bombs on nuclear sites. And that's something with which we should live. But I think what we need to understand as a movement and as an administration going forward is how we will allocate bandwidth in the future. If it's true that the People's Republic of China is the pacing threat for the U.S. military and economically, then we need to allocate bandwidth accordingly. We used probably over half of our supply of bunker busters in this attack, which is significant. Those don't get rebuilt over the course of a long weekend. The 30 plus aircraft that were involved in the strike of 3 facilities is an indication of just how precious resources are for the military. And we need to be really dutiful about how we allocate those resources going forward. So that's where I want this healthy discussion, as you say, to move towards, because these are the real kinds of trade-offs that will become a lot harder and more acute in 2026 and 2027. Perhaps we can manage it in 2025. I believe the administration can, but that doesn't mean it won't be a real trade-off for the rest of the term.
That is very well said. We will have to end it on that note. Will Tebow, thanks so much.
Thanks to you both.
Don't go anywhere. It's Bedford time. Chris Bedford coming up right after this.